Welcome back. I'm Joe.
Hey everyone, Sunny here.
We've pulled together quite a collection of sources, articles, research, your notes too, to try and make sense of a really complex picture right now.
It really is complex.
We're looking at how global trade tensions, these big geopolitical shifts, and even societal trends are all interconnected.
Absolutely.
So our mission today is to help you unpack the latest on tariffs, what happened to the G7, some pretty significant moves by China, and also this fascinating angle on Taiwan's youngest generation, Gen Z.
Yeah, that Gen Z piece is really interesting. It's a lot to cover, but hopefully we can connect some of those dots for you.
Definitely. It feels like you need to see how these separate threads actually weave together. So let's dive right in, starting with the big picture. Global trade and what came out of the G7 summit. Trade talks were huge there, but it sounds, well, complicated.
Complicated is a good word. You're seeing these ongoing, sometimes pretty difficult bilateral negotiations hitting the headlines. The sources really point to some sticky areas, like between the U.S. and Japan and the U.S. and South Korea, especially around auto tariffs.
The auto tariffs. That keeps coming up. We're told this 25% U.S. tariff could hit Japanese automakers for, what, $19 billion? That's huge.
It's a massive potential impact. And Japan's view, interestingly, is that just getting rid of their own high tariffs wouldn't actually give their economy that much of a boost. It's not a simple tit for tat for them.
Right. They're looking at the real economic effects.
Yeah.
And South Korea, they have a different angle.
Yeah, they add another layer. South Korea wants their auto tariff issues wrapped into a larger comprehensive trade deal. They don't want to negotiate it separately. So you see these specific interests kind of holding things up.
Everyone's got their own strategy. Okay, but compare that complexity to the U.S. and Vietnam. Sounds like there was some positive movement there.
Yes, actually. The sources suggest they've reached a framework agreement, and that could lead to a significant drop in Vietnam's tariffs. So that's a potentially concrete step forward.
Okay. Progress on one front. What about others? U.S., U.K.?
They agreed to implement existing agreements, which is, well, it's something. But the UK didn't get the lower steel tariffs they were hoping for.
Okay. And U.S., Canada?
A bit more optimism there, it seems. Aiming for a framework deal in the next 30 days or so.
So it's really fragmented, isn't it? Some steps forward, some areas stuck on specifics like steel or cars. Shows how tough these broad trade deals are, even among allies.
Exactly. Even within the G7, it's challenging.
So how does Taiwan fit into all this, especially with that big trade surplus they have with the U.S.?
Right. That surplus is always under scrutiny. The material shows Taiwan's been actively trying to manage it, mostly through increased investment in the U.S. and also, really significantly, through currency appreciation.
Currency appreciation. How much are we talking?
The new Taiwan dollar has gone up 11.6% in just the last 3 months.
Wow, 11.6%. That's substantial. What does that actually do for the trade balance?
Well, basically, when the NT dollar gets stronger against the U.S. dollar, Taiwanese exports become more expensive for Americans, and U.S. imports get cheaper for Taiwanese buyers. So it naturally helps narrow that trade gap over time, without needing direct tariff changes.
Makes sense. And Taiwan's also sending signals about supply chains, technology specifically.
Oh, definitely. Their Ministry of Economic Affairs put Chinese companies like Huawei and ZTE on an export control list. This isn't just paperwork, it's a clear political statement.
What's a statement?
They're positioning Taiwan as a, quote, democratic semiconductor, non-red supply chain. It's basically a warning to their own businesses.
Be careful who you sell to.
Precisely. It highlights Taiwan's commitment to being a reliable tech partner for democratic nations and tells their companies to be cautious about sensitive exports going to firms linked to Beijing. It draws a line, emphasizing their distinct place in global tech.
Interesting. And then there's the U.S.-Australia relationship, which you mentioned is kind of unusual trade-wise.
It is, yeah. Australia having a long-standing trade surplus with the U.S. is pretty rare for a developed ally.
And there's a specific section point, beef.
Exactly, beef imports. The U.S. has concerns about Australia's biosecurity rules, specifically related to BSE mad cow disease. It affects beef coming from the U.S.-Mexico-Canada border region.
Right, and Australia is sticking to its guns on that.
Seems so. The Prime Minister stated they'll adhere to their biosecurity principles. So it just shows even close allies can have these persistent trade disagreements over specific things like agriculture or health standards.
Yeah, really underscores the complexity. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. From trade to geopolitics, the Middle East. Still very tense, obviously, though maybe the immediate fears of a huge Israel-Iran escalation have eased just slightly.
There have been some signals from Tehran looking for de-escalation, which is noteworthy. But yeah, the situation is still incredibly tense. The information we have makes it clear Israel plans to continue strikes against Iran's missile and nuclear programs.
And they're aiming beyond just nuclear stuff, right? To weaken their conventional military, too.
That's the stated goal, yes. Weakening conventional military and leadership. It's part of ongoing actions since October 7th strikes in Gaza, Lebanon, against the Houthis. Israel even claims they're ahead of schedule.
And President Trump's role in 2025, according to these sources, adds a layer of unpredictability.
Definitely. Things like posting social media messages calling for Tehran residents to evacuate. Well, unconventional.
Unconventional is one word for it.
It adds uncertainty.
Yeah.
And him leaving the G7 summit early, citing the Middle East crisis, meaning he missed meetings with leaders from Ukraine, Mexico, Australia, that really signals his focus shifted squarely onto Iran.
But the U.S. role in the actual conflict has been more defensive.
Primarily, yes. The sources describe it as providing logistical support, intelligence, helping Israel defend against Iranian attacks, rather than joining in offensively.
And at the G7, Trump didn't sign that joint statement calling for de-escalation.
Correct. And that highlights a fundamental difference in approach. His view, as presented, leans towards diplomacy and direct deals to solve the Iran nuclear issue. It fits with him calling himself a tariff person, seeing things through direct negotiation, maybe less through traditional multilateral statements like other G7 leaders prefer.
It is interesting, though, despite all the tension, that major oil infrastructure hasn't been hit hard and the Strait of Hormuz is still open.
That's a critical point. It suggests maybe all sides are being somewhat cautious, reluctant to do something that would cause a massive oil price spike or destabilize the region in a way that hurts everyone, including themselves.
A calculated standoff, perhaps?
Possibly. But markets are still nervous. Gold prices are staying at historic highs, that classic safe haven, and oil prices bounced back after dipping initially.
And quickly, other hotspots, Ukraine.
Yeah, Russian missile attack on Kyiv, unfortunately. Injuries reported. And President Zelensky missing a full day at the G7 because Trump left early. That's another consequence of these intertwined crises.
And North Korea. Still a worry.
Always. The material notes their potential warhead count might have increased, maybe from 60 up to 90 this year. Trump's shown interest in personal diplomacy before, but North Korea seems cautious, leading to renewed tensions there.
Got it. Now, there was something mentioned about a potential UK statement on nuclear retaliation if Ukraine faced a nuclear attack. What's the reality there?
Based on the information we have, there's no clear public evidence of a direct official UK government statement making that specific threat. The UK is a nuclear power, supports Ukraine strongly, of course, but official nuclear policy is usually extremely cautious about making explicit public threats like that. It's very sensitive.
So important to distinguish official policy from, say, unverified social media chatter.
Absolutely crucial. Be wary of claims that aren't backed by official sources, especially in that domain.
Good point. Okay, let's pivot again. Let's talk about China's actions at sea. A growing presence, expanding reach.
A major development, yeah. The sources really emphasize this. China's Navy isn't just sticking to the first island chain anymore, near Japan, Taiwan, Philippines. They're pushing much further out, towards the second island chain.
Which runs where?
It stretches from Japan down past Guam towards Indonesia, a much bigger operational area.
And this isn't just a one-off exercise. We saw sustained activity recently.
That's right. After the Dragon Boat Festival this year, it wasn't just one group. The Liaoning Carrier Group plus other fleets were active around Taiwan and the South China Sea. That's become more common. But the key thing was multiple fleets pushing deep into the West Pacific, getting quite close to strategic spots like Guam and Iwo Jima.
Multiple fleets close to Guam. That sounds like a significant show of force.
It absolutely is. We're talking multiple ships operating together, both their aircraft carriers, the Liaoning and the Shandong, operating at the same time. Plus, advanced destroyers, frigates, supply ships. The sources mentioned 8 vessels in those specific West Pacific drills.
What kind of drills?
The whole range. Joint air and sea ops, anti-submarine warfare, air defense. They're practicing operating far from home. The Liaoning apparently had 260 aircraft takeoffs and landings during that period alone.
So what's the strategic thinking behind pushing out that far?
Well, several things. One, it builds their blue water navy capability. Two, and this is key, they're practicing tactics designed to block access or deny areas that A280 can intercept to potential U.S. and Japanese forces in a conflict scenario, like one over Taiwan.
So getting your Guam is a direct message about that capability.
Precisely. Guam is central to the U.S. military posture in the West Pacific. Operating near there is a way to demonstrate they could potentially interfere with U.S. reinforcement routes if a conflict started. It's a direct challenge.
It sends a political signal too, right? Especially with the new administration in Taiwan.
Exactly. China frames these deployments as building defense depth and responding to what they call U.S. and Japanese provocations, things like U.S. arms sales to Taiwan or Japan boosting defenses nearby.
And they're making sure people know about it.
Oh, yeah. They talk about complying with international law, but they heavily publicize these drills. It projects power and promotes this idea of co-governance in the Pacific, challenging that long-held U.S. dominance.
How does this compare to, say, the lessons from Russia and Ukraine?
Well, Ukraine shows that major military actions can lead to isolation, sanctions, and fierce resistance. China's naval moves, while intimidating, seem designed to use that gray zone approach, constant drills, sailing through sensitive zones to apply pressure without triggering a full-blown conflict and that kind of international backlash.
It's a different calculation than, say, historical border issues with Russia over outer Manchuria.
Very different. With Russia, a nuclear power, China eventually settled via diplomacy and economic ties. Taiwan isn't nuclear, and it seems to be a much more direct, strategic, and ideological focus for China's current military posture. Which brings us right to Taiwan's Z generation.
Right, Gen Z, born roughly 97 to 2012. So teens and young adults now. A big group, about 20% of Taiwan's population, and very active.
Extremely active, politically and socially. They grew up entirely digital, immersed in social media. And they strongly value freedom, democracy, and their distinct Taiwanese identity.
We saw their influence in the 2024 election.
Absolutely. A higher share of Gen Z voted for the DPP, signaling a preference for the status quo, resisting Beijing's unification push. They were vocal supporting Hong Kong's protests in 2019, and they actively use platforms like X to push back against unification narratives, strengthening their own identity.
And the identity numbers are striking.
Yeah. Polls show over 70% of Taiwan's Gen Z identify primarily as Taiwanese, not Chinese. That's way up from maybe 50% in the 80s. For them, democracy isn't just inherited, it's a core value, and they're very skeptical of the CCP's authoritarian system.
It feels like Taiwan itself is a successful democracy. Prosperous acts as a sort of counter-argument just by existing.
That's a great way to think about it. A stark mirror, as one source put it. Taiwan's prosperity GDP per capita much higher than China's, around 36K versus 13K, plus its vibrant democracy. It shows a Chinese-speaking society can thrive democratically. That directly challenges the CCP's narrative that only single-party rule works for China. It potentially undermines their legitimacy.
And Gen Z is good at using digital tools to spread that message.
Very skilled, using platforms like X to share democratic ideas, counter CCP info ops. The material mentioned posts from this year where young Taiwanese respond to military drills by saying freedom is non-negotiable. That gets Taiwan's perspective out internationally.
So the CCP sees this generation as a real ideological threat, maybe even more than military hardware.
In a fundamental way, yes. Taiwan's democratic success, especially resonating with its connected youth, challenges the CCP's legitimacy more directly than, say, old border issues. This young generation with global connections and digital skills feels like an internal threat to the CCP's narrative.
So how does Beijing try to deal with this perceived threat from young Taiwanese?
They try a few things, but the sources suggest it's not very effective with this group. Military intimidation is one of those big drills around Taiwan, simulating blockades like after Lai Ching-te's inauguration. The hope is to scare them away from independence.
Plus information warfare.
Definitely. Cognitive warfare, pushing propaganda on platforms like TikTok, WeChat, trying to weaken that local identity. But Gen Z seems quite savvy and wary of CCP manipulation. It has limited success.
And economic pressure. Restricting imports.
Yes, hoping to sway voters who rely on cross-strait trade. But again, for Gen Z, their ideological commitment often seems stronger than short-term economic worries.
It's almost ironic. China's military pressure seems to be backfiring with this generation.
It really seems to be reinforcing the anti-unification sentiment. Those carrier drills near Guam aren't seen as distant maneuvers. They're seen as a direct threat to their democracy. It strengthens their local identity, not weakens it. And their digital activism connects Taiwan's cause globally, finding common ground with others wary of China's expansion, like Japan.
And they're not just online, they're focused on civic defense, too.
Yes. Creating memes is one thing, but they're also participating in civil defense drills, preparing for potential blockades, invasions. It echoes what we saw with young Ukrainians, showing how smaller nations can use resolve and technology.
And politically, they back parties wanting stronger defense.
Exactly. Supporting increased defense budgets, Taiwan's is up to 2.5% of GDP this year, and focusing on asymmetric capabilities like drones and missiles to counter China's navy effectively.
So the CCP is kind of stuck. Taiwan's democracy is a challenge, and their pressure tactics seem to strengthen the resistance, especially among the youth.
It looks like a difficult cycle for Beijing. This active, globally connected young generation in Taiwan presents a potent, ongoing ideological challenge that's very different from, say, settle historical border disputes with Russia.
Okay, let's try and quickly tie some of this back to the broader economy. Japan's inflation is still bubbling?
Still rising, yeah. Services and rent pushing it past the Bank of Japan's target. You have negative real interest rates. The BOJ seems concerned about imbalances from keeping rates too low, hinting they might raise them. The yen has been hovering around 144, 145 to the dollar. They're watching that for import inflation, too.
And the U.S. Fed, holding steady for now, but maybe a cut later this year.
That's the general expectation, maybe September. Partly seeing signs of the job market softening a bit, unemployment claims rising. Some experts predict maybe 50 to 100 basis points in cuts over the next year.
Which could help the stock market.
Could help keep it resilient, yeah. The S&P 500 has been strong, maybe heading towards 6,400. Corporate earnings expected to grow around 4%. Spending is stable, but yeah, that job market softening is the thing to watch.
Is there a direct link we should think about between tariffs and currencies?
There can be. High tariffs can contribute to a currency weakening. The analysis suggested Asian currencies might weaken against the dollar, partly because they face high average tariffs, like 34%. But the bigger picture forecast is still for the dollar to potentially weaken overall against most major currencies eventually.
Any interesting investment trends mentioned?
Active ETFs are definitely growing, and big players like BlackRock are looking more at alternative assets, digital assets, gold bringing them into mainstream portfolios.
Gold's still looking strong then?
Seems so. Global uncertainty, central banks buying, those expected rate cuts, maybe a weaker dollar, all supportive factors. Buying on dips was mentioned as a possible strategy.
And just looping back one last time to Israel-Iran.
Yeah.
Any final nuance on how that might play out?
One perspective noted was that this might not just be quick strikes like in the past. It could potentially become a more complex, maybe more open-ended conflict. Extreme outcomes aren't seen as the most likely immediate path, but they're still considered possible. It's fragile.
Wow. Okay, so you really can see how all these different threads, trade talks, G7 dynamics, Middle East tensions, China's naval strategy, Taiwan's Gen Z, they're not separate issues. They're all pulling on each other.
Absolutely. Geopolitics, economics, military moves, societal values, they're incredibly intertwined right now. Understanding these layers objectively is just crucial.
It really is. It's a lot to wrap our heads around, but hopefully this deep dive helped connect some of those dots for you.
We hope so. Thinking about how these events ripple outwards is really key.
So here's a final thought for you to mull over, based on everything we've touched on. As global powers project their strength and navigate these complex economic and military pathways, what fundamental role will the values, the actions, and maybe even the digital savvy of the youngest generations like Taiwan's Gen Z using their tools for democratic resistance actually play in shaping the real geopolitical landscape of the future? Thanks for joining us. I just want to give another shout out to Micky from Mickytolife. His channel is a treasure trove of inspiration, and he's a huge Sip&Talk fan.
Absolutely. Make sure to check him out and maybe even share your awesome podcast intro with him once you've created it.